So let me start the show by saying I'm going to create a new position in America called, it'll not be the president, not be the CEO. It'll be the vice president, one of like 10 vice presidents in charge of common sense. And from that, we'll start with the Boogie Cousins trade. So Boogie Cousins is in Sacramento, and he's uncoachable, difficult. Grant Napier is a very respected announcer in the NBA for the Sacramento Kings. Has been for a long time. Very good, very prominent, very respected. Basically was on Twitter last night saying nobody liked to play with him. You can blame the Kings all you want. Nobody wanted to play with DeMarcus Cousins. So 3 issues with DeMarcus Cousins going to New Orleans. Number 1, the Kings threw shade at him. He could be grumpy. Number 2, he lost $30 million in the deal. He could be grumpy. Number 3, can he handle being the number 2 guy? He could be grumpy. See a connective thread? Grumpy guy, 3 more reasons to be grumpy. It's not going to work. But the thing about this was, we see it all the time in sports. It's a desperate move by a desperate franchise. New Orleans last year had the lowest TV ratings in the NBA. It is a desperate move by a desperate franchise. But I'm not here to pick on New Orleans because the New York Knicks did the same thing. Desperate people do desperate things. I didn't save for college. Let's play the lottery. I tapped into my 401k for a sports car. Let's have a risky business venture to see if I can make up that lost money. Desperate people and desperate teams do desperate things. The New York Knicks. Let's bring in the often hurt, highly expensive Derrick Rose. Desperate team does desperate things. Now they want to trade him to Minnesota. The Lakers brought in Mozgov and Luol Deng for a combined $136 million. So as the league is getting smaller, quicker, and more nimble, we brought in a heavy-footed 7-footer and an old forward. How about the Bulls? We're going to rebuild around Jimmy Butler. Nah, let's bring in 2 guards who can't shoot. Rondo and D. Wade. Desperate people and desperate teams do desperate things. That's all the DeMarcus Cousins trade is. New Orleans had the lowest TV ratings. They have Anthony Davis and nothing else. And now they're going big with a guy that couldn't get along with any of Sacramento's players. And let me go back to this position I have created in sports. It's not the CEO, but if you know any company of any size, they have the president, and then there's about 8 vice presidents. They're in charge of marketing, and a vice president in charge of finance, and a vice president in charge of human resources. I've worked at companies that have a lot of vice presidents, and they have very important positions at companies. The new one is vice president in charge of common sense. Just think of things that have happened in the NBA and pro sports recently. And the reason I love the vice president of common sense, I wouldn't have him in the building. He would not work in the building. He would not work at the movie studio. He would not work with a franchise. He would not be compromised by relationships. In Hollywood, if I worked at Universal or I worked at 20th Century Fox, I would have a director, vice president in charge of common sense. He'd live in Ohio. He wouldn't go to dinner with agents and actors and casting directors and producers and money people. He would be a guy living in the Midwest who could go, God, that makes no sense. The movie Lolita. All right, what's the lead character? Not joking, a child molester. We're going to pass on that. I live in Ohio. I'm not compromised. That movie was made twice in Hollywood. I'm going to pass on that. Anybody see Free State of Jones by Matthew McConaughey? Oh, when's the last time you and 5 guys were sitting around? What do you want to watch? A movie about the Confederacy. That's never happened ever. In any room of men ever, ever. But somebody owed Matthew McConaughey a favor. Think about decisions made where you're too insular. The NBA introduced a new basketball and didn't ask the players. Vice president of common sense would have said, you may want to ask LeBron what he thinks about it and Chris Paul, since they, play with it. The Houston Texans signed Brock Osweiler. If they had a vice president in charge of common sense who lived in Kansas City, he would have said, well, did you interview him? No, we've never talked to him. I'm going to pass on that deal. Major League Baseball allowed Frank McCourt to buy a baseball team on a credit card. Frank McCourt had no money. Somebody in the Major League offices in New York said, he's got a visa. He's got a MasterCard. Let him have the Dodgers. He ruined the franchise briefly. It is remarkable how often, because this is the way companies work, you tend to overjudge your own people. A movie studio likes its actors more than the public does. Maybe a broadcasting company likes their people more than the public does. NBA executives like their personnel more than really their worth. I mean, the NHL hired Barry Melrose in Tampa. He'd been out of coaching for 13 years. He lasted 2.5 weeks. If Tampa, the Lightning, had a vice president in charge of common sense who lived, let's say, in Indianapolis, he would have said, he's been out of the league for a decade and a half. I'm going to pass on him. Probably a guy in the AHL, Russian Hockey League. Somebody that could coach, knows players, has a relationship with some current stars. The Lakers gave Kobe Bryant, after he tore his Achilles, $50 million. He was 35, 36 years old. You know what happens to 36-year-old people who tear their Achilles in the NBA? They stink. The Lakers backed up the Brinks truck, gave him $50 million. So when I look, it should be noted, you got to give the Boston Celtics credit because the Celtics were never interested in DeMarcus Cousins. Not even for Marcus Smart, Jay Crowder, B- guys were never interested. Why? Because they did their homework, and apparently the Boston Celtics have a vice president in charge of common sense. That the most difficult guy to coach in the league that didn't get along with anybody in Sacramento may help us at times on the floor, but will ruin our locker room, will ruin our chemistry, will take a young, bright, moving coach in the right direction, Brad Stevens, and puncture all that momentum. Sports is a fascinating thing. It's very much like Hollywood. Sometimes you see deals made and you think to yourself, how did that get greenlit? Who approved the new basketball? Who signed Brock Osweiler? How did the NFL let the Chargers move into a soccer stadium? I can't be the only person that sees this stuff. I'm sure you do as well. You've watched the movie with friends and thought, Matt Damon is going to save the Great Wall of China from dragons. That's probably only going to work in China. That's not going to work here.
So we're all too close to it? Is that what we're saying?
I think what happens is if you take the emotion out of sports and you just had somebody in your company that was not on the premises, that could step away and was not compromised by agents and friends and didn't go to the NBA All-Star game, but you just sent it to his office in Indianapolis and said, okay, Vice President, does this make sense to you? And he would ask a series of questions. And if everybody had that, you wouldn't have awful NBA deals. You wouldn't compromise your franchise with Boogie Cousins. You wouldn't create a new basketball and not ask the players. You wouldn't sign Brock Osweiler. You wouldn't move an NFL team from San Diego down the road, which loves their team, to Los Angeles to a soccer stadium. You wouldn't hire an analyst in hockey who's been out of the sport for a decade and a half. I mean, most of this stuff is just common sense. But I think when you're in the building, you get compromised, you have friends, you get emotional, you overvalue your own people, and you don't take a deep breath and go, I was telling a friend this the other day. My golden rule in life, whenever something bad happens, is take a deep breath. 98%, now I want you to all think about this, 98% of all trades on Wall Street happen on 1% of the days. Now think about that. Virtually all of the trading on Wall Street happens in 1% of the days. Translation? Panic. Oh my God. The answer to everything, anytime there's crisis with your children, with an NBA trade, here comes the deadline. Let's call our vice president in charge of common sense. There is a short supply everywhere in America.